Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Bipartisan Policy Center. My name is Dennis Shea, and I am the Executive Director of the J. Ronald Terwilliger Center for Housing Policy here at BPC. This will be the 8th conversation in our Housing Leaders Speaker Series, which aims to spotlight individuals who understand the foundational importance of housing and have made significant contributions to improving housing affordability. We are thrilled to have one such guest with us today, and that's Greg Gianforte, the 25th governor of the great state of Montana. Prior to assuming the reins in Helena, Governor Gianforte represented Montana in the U.S. House of Representatives after 34 years in the private sector, where he was a highly successful software engineer and businessman. Ensuring housing affordability is a national challenge, but it is an especially difficult one in Montana, which has become one of the nation's fastest growing states, perhaps a victim of its own success as a very attractive place to live and work. With housing demand exceeding supply, rents and home sale prices in the state have risen dramatically over the past several years. Governor Gianforte has made identifying and advancing bipartisan solutions to housing affordability the challenge a top priority. 2 years ago, he created a housing task force with the broad mandate to make housing more affordable and attainable for Montanans. The recommendations of this task force and the efforts of the Montana legislature have already produced a series of new laws that streamline the housing development process and dramatically reform zoning and land use in the state. Some have dubbed it the Montana miracle. So, Governor, I want to thank you for making housing a top priority, and I also want to thank you for joining us. I also want to welcome your wife, the First Lady of Montana, Susan Gianforte, who's with us here today. But before starting our conversation, let me remind our virtual audience that if you have any questions for Governor Gianforte, you can post them to our Twitter X account at BPC_bipartisan throughout the event using the hashtag BPC Live. You are also welcome to submit your questions in the YouTube chat, and we will save time at the end of the event to take questions from both our in-person and virtual audiences. So again, Governor, thank you so much for being with us today.
Dennis, thank you for having me.
Yeah. So I know we're going to spend a lot of time talking about housing, but let's go 30,000 feet. You've been governor for 3+ years. How's the state doing, and what are your priorities besides housing?
Yeah, so again, thank you for having me in. Sure. Thank everybody for joining us today. I ran for 2 reasons. Montana had not really been living up to its full potential. We export the best beef in the world, we export a lot of grain, and we export our kids because we didn't have enough jobs. So I'm a business guy, electrical engineer by training, and our first focus was really to get the economy going. So that's where our focus has been. It's really both jobs, so our kids can stay if they want to, and then protect our way of life. And we were able to pass a really conservative budget where we funded all essential services in 2001 and 2022. And that brought us into we have the great blessing of our legislature only meets for 90 days every 2 years. So we didn't see him again until 2023. And in that session, we came in with a significant surplus, $2.5 billion surplus on about a $5 billion budget. So what we did was we gave $1 billion back to the people of Montana in tax refunds and lower rates. We fixed everything that was broken. We invested $300 million in behavioral health. We rebuilt our in expanded capacity in our prison system, a lot of roads and bridges work. We increased our reserves. We still had money left over, so we paid off all the state debt. We're completely debt-free as a state now. And
wow.
That I don't know of another state that's done that.
Wow.
But that was just applying basic business principles to budgeting. So our economy now, we've had 24 consecutive months where unemployment's been 3% or less. So the economy, we're the 7th fastest growing economy in the country. And that's good. We're creating the jobs.
That's great. Well, you're creating jobs, you're creating more demand for housing. I assume people are coming into the state. I've been reading about that. So why did you begin focusing on the housing affordability challenge, and how have housing costs changed since the time you've been governor till today?
Yeah. So the reason we focused on housing was it's probably the number one issue facing working families, because we want our nurses and our teachers and our police officers to live in the communities where they serve. And when housing prices get out of reach, not only is the American dream more difficult to attain, but the people we need that are the fabric of our communities can't be there.
Why did you make housing such a priority?
Well, it's really, as I mentioned, we want our teachers and police officers to live in the communities where they serve. And as prices increased, it was less attainable. So this was, as I said, I've said many times, this is the number one issue facing working Montana families, and we had to do something about it.
So what did you issued an executive order establishing a task force. Tell us about that and how that worked.
Yeah, so this is a process that we've used a couple of times now on big thorny issues, because we knew there wasn't a single button we could push to lower prices. And we also knew the problem was so big, we couldn't buy our way out of it. There just wasn't enough money in a budget. So we assembled a team, really diverse team of nonprofit leaders, county commissioners, city folks, state officials, people from private sector, builders, realtors. And we brought them together, and I brought them together in August and said, we need results quickly. We're heading up into our legislative session. So they assembled in August. I got my first report in October. And my charge to them was really simple: cast a really broad net and give us a range of ideas. And they did. Mm-hmm. I got the first report the middle of October, the second report the middle of December, and then we went to work in the legislative session, and we kind of ran the table.
Do you think the fact that you had broad membership and the fact that you had a tight deadline with a very specific assignment for the task force was part of the secret sauce to make that effective?
It allowed us to build consensus around what could have been a very thorny issue in a very quick way. And given we came into the session with that bipartisan support, we were able to get the stuff done. So I think it made a big difference.
So the task force had 36 recommendations, and how was it received by the legislature initially? Did you have to really kind of muscle the legislature to say,
well,
take up the
our legislature can't be muscled. They're independent thinkers. So we had to build consensus around these issues. But we always brought it back to we wanted our teachers, our police officers, our nurses to live in the communities where they served. And that was something everybody could support. And that's been my experience when Susan and I had a chance to serve in Congress here. We'd have people to dinner at our home on Capitol Hill every week, bipartisan groups. And when you break bread with people and you share time together and you focus on the key principle you're trying to achieve, it's a lot easier to build consensus.
Mm-hmm. So some of the things the task force recommended, as I understand, were to allow multifamily residential in single-family zoned areas, to allow ADUs without parking minimums associated with it. These are some of the things that that they recommended. And so, it seems like it was a supply issue, and using deregulation as a means of increasing housing density. And tell me the concern. Is it really? Is that right? It was more focused on supply and how to build more homes.
Well, that was the problem. We had, in part because everybody discovered that Montana is more beautiful than any other state in the country, and the show Yellowstone and the pandemic combined that everybody was moving there. And if they weren't moving there as a permanent residence, they bought a home as a second home and took that out of the inventory. So it was, our population over the last 10 years has grown by 10%. The number of new doorknobs has only grown by 7%. Plus we had these added homes taken out of inventory for second homes. So we had a supply problem. And that was something we recognized early in the process. So we focused on supply issues. You mentioned a couple of things we did. Really, there were, I would say, 7 buckets of reforms that
Please,
we.
could you go through those?
Yeah, sure. So
Governor?
I'll just kind of tick
Yeah.
them off. The first was and recognizing that government regulations account for about 40% of the cost of a new home. We had to reduce that. I had one builder in Missoula that told me he was building a multifamily apartment building, maybe 15 units or so. He had a year delay in permitting that added $700,000 to the cost of the building. And the only option he had was to add that into the price.
Right.
So the first thing we did was we changed our land use planning regime to streamline permitting so builders can get permits faster. We want to make sure the public has input into how communities grow. But what this new law allows is local communities to adopt a growth plan. They go through all the public hearings, everybody gets their input, but then when a builder walks in and says, I want a permit, if it matches that growth plan, they just hand them the permit. You don't
As
have to
of
go,
right.
Here you go.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to go through public hearings because the overall growth plan has already gone through the public hearing process. So that was reform number one. It also we required local jurisdiction to adopt a whole bunch of changes in their zoning rules. The second major problem we found as we looked at this was there's all kinds of infrastructure programs, low interest loans for municipalities, but they're all focused on urban renewal. They will pay for replacement of water and sewer. We didn't have any infrastructure funds for new water and sewer in new subdivisions, and that was our problem. We were growing. So we had a surplus, fortunately. We put over $100 million into something we called the Homes Loan Program, which provides low interest loans to communities to do water and sewer for new subdivisions, but we required that they have at least 10 units per acre. So it was more workforce housing oriented. And this, because before we did that, a builder would have to put the water and sewer infrastructure in, add it to the price of the homes, which made the homes less affordable. This way, the ongoing tax obligation of the homes pay back the bond over time. So that's a change. The third area, as you mentioned, we allowed ADUs as a right to any single family home anywhere in the state. That could be a tiny home in the backyard. It could be an apartment over the garage. But this increases infill and it provides first-time homes for these people we want to have in our communities. We also changed the zoning at a state level to allow apartments in all commercial areas. So you could have retail on the first floor, apartments upstairs. Not all zoning allowed that. That's number 4. Number 5, we ended exclusionary zoning, which, in many communities, they required big houses on big lots. Well, they're more expensive when you do that. So we allowed smaller houses on smaller lots, and anywhere in the state where a single family home is allowed, we now allow a duplex. So that was done statewide. We also changed the way we do local design review. Most of the local design reviews in our state and many places are volunteer boards, and they all come to that with their own particular agenda. Maybe they like cedar siding. Maybe somebody likes a certain species of tree. So we abolished all the volunteer zoning review boards in the state and require that professional officials at the local level review that, and their requirements on builders are restricted to safety issues. So they can require, for example, a sidewalk because you don't want people walking in the street, but they can't tell you have to plant trees, right? So it's things like that. And then finally, because we recognized we had a supply problem, if we wanted more homes, we need more carpenters and plumbers and electricians. So we changed our apprenticeship ratios and in the process quadrupled the number of apprenticeship slots. So to put that in perspective, since we made the change, we now allow a journeyman to supervise 2 apprentices, whereas before we required 2 journeymen for every apprentice. So in the process, we quadrupled it. We added more apprentices in 2022 than 18, 19, and 20 combined. So we have over 3,000 people now in the
Wow.
building trades apprentices. And the last thing in that category of trades education, we added a state tax credit where we'll pay any any business up to $3,000 scholarship money, up to 50% of the cost of the tuition to send employees to trade school.
It's amazing. So I can understand why this has been dubbed the Montana miracle.
Yeah.
I mean, these are actions that blue states would be envious of. I know Montana's a pretty red state.
I did have a blue governor say to me, "How the hell did you get that done?"
Well, how did you get it done?
Well,
I mean,
by bringing people together.
right.
And what's most gratifying is we're seeing results now. There was a survey that came out 2 months ago in Missoula, one of our largest communities, where in the last year, because of the increase in supply, the vacancy rates for apartments has dropped from just over 1%, which is way too tight a market,
Right.
to just over 6% in that market. And the average rental rate has come down by 20% in the last year. We're getting anecdotal evidence in Bozeman that similar things are happening. So the free market has responded to these changes and reduction in red tape and increase of workers, and rental rates are coming down and vacancy rates for apartments are going up to something more reasonable.
But then there are the courts. There have been a couple of, there's at least been one challenge to a number of these provisions through the court system in Montana. Could you talk about that and what's going on in terms of the status?
Well, we think those are particularly bad decisions, so we're appealing them. We built consensus, and we think we'll prevail.
Okay, great. Now the task force did its job. I'm amazed, a 5-month deadline. Usually when you have a task force or commission, you don't work that
I
work
put
that
an
quickly.
engineer in charge.
Oh, you did? Okay. There you go. But it's still around. It's still kicking.
Yeah.
It's you reauthorized it, as I understand it, for till 2025.
Yes.
What else is on its plan?
Well, the charge to the current task force is twofold. One is we made all these changes. We want to know if they're working. So
Right.
they're studying the outcomes of the policy changes that we adopted, number one. And then anybody that's worked with you very long will know that I always say, I think better is always possible. So as we study the changes we made and the impact they're having, the question becomes, how can we do better? So we're going to look at another phase of policies. Our legislature, love them to death. They'll be back in 2025. And we hope
For 90 days.
for 90 days.
Is that hard and fast rule?
Yes.
Great. So I was going to ask you, nationally, you sort of answered my question, but nationally there's been a lot of anecdotal evidence that there's a dearth of skilled residential construction workers. Never fully recovered from the Great Recession when a lot of those folks sort of left the business because no housing was being built. But is that still a challenge? You seem to have a program to
Well, we have
deal with that.
a number of programs. I mentioned the MTech, which is the Montana Education Technical Credit, which helps with paying the scholarship. But the other thing we've done is, I don't think as a nation we've done a particularly good job of exposing K through 12 students to alternative career paths, particularly in the construction trades and manufacturing and anything else. I mean, you ask little kids, what do you want to be when you grow up? They say policemen, firemen, which is great, but that's who they see working. So one of the other reforms we've adopted is something called the workplace learning experiences. So now any Montana high school student can spend 2 to 20 hours a week on a job site and get high school graduation credit for it. And then we're partnering between the local chambers of commerce. So like in Kalispell, Montana, the local chamber recruits their members for internships for high school students. And then there's a full-time person at the high school, and they place those students with those companies in the private sector. And it's a full gamut. It's not just construction trades. There's high school students that are spending time in law offices, architecture offices, manufacturing, heavy equipment operators across the board, and it's opening up new horizons. Students may still decide they want to go to a 4-year degree program, but they may end up becoming an apprentice. And I was with
Being exposed to some different.
yeah, we even have Kalispell actually has taken the step. They've hired an individual to do workplace learning experiences for K through 8. So you might ask the question, how do you expose a second grader to the construction trades? Well, they do field trips. They go out to a job site. They see people putting up homes. They go into a manufacturing plant, and instead of, they may still want to be a fireman or a policeman, but now they might say, well, I want to operate that machine that cuts the metal.
Right.
So it's just exposing them to different career options.
Okay. Yeah, you put that little seed in their brain, and it just sort of blossoms maybe 5 or 6 or 10 years down the road. So, before entering politics, you started a very successful software company. Do you see any possibilities for new technologies? There's a lot going on in the construction space, but new technologies, AI, playing any role in speeding up and reducing the cost of building new housing? Because I know in places like Montana, rural states, there's no scale for a home builder, right? I mean, you just can't build 1 home or 2 homes and really make a living. So, like off-site construction is a possibility. Factory built.
So I think it's ripe for innovation in the way we do it. We did recruit, as we've improved our business climate, we did recruit a manufactured home business to Montana.
Okay.
DeVel, they're going to be in Butte, Silver Bow. They're going to hire 450 employees and build manufactured homes for the whole Rocky Mountain region. We are the first state in the country to actually incorporate into our building codes the ability for 3D printed homes.
Oh.
I don't know that anybody's doing that yet, but
it's
on the
there
books.
There are a few companies. Yeah.
I mean, there are. I'm not sure they're building them in Montana yet, but we are the first state to actually do that.
Wow.
And we are starting to experiment with AI. Remember that 40% of the cost of new construction is government regulations. One of the particular problems we have with our regs, I don't think we're different than other places, is they get edited over decades. And it's sort of like remodeling an old home, where maybe some of you have had this experience. You go in and, there's shag carpet in the living room, and somebody has put linoleum over it, and then they put hardwood floor on top of that.
Yeah.
I mean, it's bad.
It's like an archaeological dig.
Correct. So we initiated a massive red tape relief effort, and we went through every line of every piece of code in every agency, and I signed into law almost 200 red tape relief bills this last legislative session. But they're still too complicated. You need too many years of education to write them. So one of the things we're experimenting with now is putting our state regs, whether it's building codes or environmental quality regs, into an AI model and telling it to rewrite it at a high school graduation level. And then we'll still have to edit it, but we'd like the regs that we have to have for public safety and to protect the environment to be understandable by a Main Street business person.
Interesting.
We put it in a linguistic model, and we learned that our regs, and I don't think we're different than anybody else, requires a PhD plus postdoctoral work to understand them.
Wow.
And that's beyond the reach of most entrepreneurs.
Yeah. AI can help make sense of some of the zoning laws that exist throughout the country. So I know you're way out in Montana, but you spent two terms, I believe, in Congress. I'm a little hesitant to ask you this question, but where does the federal government fit in? What could Congress do to make it easier for your administration to ensure that Montanans have access to reasonably affordable housing? What can Washington do, if anything?
I think there's 2 things.
Okay.
Stop spending so much money, because the money supply is what's driving inflation, and it's inflation that's driven up the price of homes. So that'd be number 1, and then number 2, just stay out of our way.
Stay out of your. Okay. So do we have any questions here from? Yes, sir.
Yes. To lower housing costs, do you, number 1, support accommodating immigrants who have the ability and desire to construct needed housing? And 2, oppose tariffs construction materials regardless of the president in office? Thank you.
Yeah, well, I think we should encourage legal immigration to the country. My primary concern is the illegal immigration that's been occurring. We've seen about 10 million people come in illegally into the country, and that places a burden on all of our communities.
And what about tariffs? Lumber.
I'm kind of in the Milton Friedman school.
Very good. Good.
But I'm on the Bob Lighthizer school, so. I used to work for him. Yeah, yes, ma'am.
How are you using those housing initiatives and changes to recruit more businesses to the state?
Yeah, thank you. Well, we initiated a new program, and this is a thank you. I'll put out an open invitation to folks. At the Department of Commerce, we've created a program called our Red Carpet Program. And as we've adopted more pro-business policies, we've lowered taxes. What we offer companies interested in moving to Montana is a sanctuary for freedom and free enterprise, and a work ethic that won't quit, and a quality of life that inspires tremendous work. We've had some great successes. I mentioned this manufactured home business. That's a significant, that'll become the largest employer in Butte when they fully hire out. We just recruited a business, a German manufacturer to Lewistown. It'll be 500 employees there in that community, a $90 million investment. We recruited Brickstell to Glendive. That is 350 employees. We have 150 businesses in the pipeline. It's not too hard. I hope this doesn't get me in trouble, but all you got to do is knock on a door in California and say, you want to move back to America?
We have a question here from our virtual audience. In addition to rising home prices, Montana has also seen some of the sharpest increases in homelessness in the country. What's driving this trend, and how is the state addressing the problem?
Yeah, we saw it in our hometown of Bozeman. We had people living in RVs on the streets right down the street from our home, and it's tragic. That's why increasing the supply of homes is so important, to make it more attainable, and that's why we took all the actions that we did. We've also seen, these illegal immigrants have been relocated to every community in the United States, and we're seeing that as well. And we have an obligation to take care of them when they arrive. But we'd be better off if we sealed the border.
So, so you mentioned on homelessness, you mentioned supply, the lack of supply being a big part of the problem. You also, earlier in the conversation, Governor, you mentioned that you've devoted some spending for mental health assistance. Could you talk?
Yeah, really.
How do you see the problem? Is this mostly a supply issue or combination of factors?
Well, you have to recognize that the two sides of the coin are mental health and addiction. We've seen a 78% increase in fentanyl the last year in Montana. It's all coming across the southern border. As I talk to local law enforcement, 80 to 90% of the inmates in county detention centers have behavioral health issues. So we asked the legislature, and they gave us $300 million for behavioral health, which is a massive investment. And we're using those funds in a couple of ways. One is we're going to the point of need because we want to help people get healthy. One of those places is bringing behavioral health into the county detention centers and into the state prison so that people can get healthier and be productive members of society. We're also, prior administrations had shut down community-based mental health. So we're bringing those services back with mobile crisis centers and other things of that sort. So we have also a bipartisan commission because I don't have appropriations authority. Only the legislature has appropriations authority, and they only meet for 90 days every 2 years. We needed a way to make these decisions. So what we did, the legislature, working together with our administration, we created a behavioral health commission, and the legislature delegated appropriations authority to them for this $300 million.
Okay.
So as they're hearing of the needs in the community, they have the ability to actually spend the money between legislative sessions. And I think I've approved 5 or 6 programs under that commission so far, like behavioral health in the county detention centers, these mobile crisis response teams,
Right.
that sort of stuff.
Great. Yes, sir. Could you stand, please? And
By the way, but just piggybacking off of the previous question, I know your predecessor had signed into the eviction moratorium that most states had. I know incoming, how did you in your new administration deal with it in terms of the courts, allotting of federal funds, etc.? I know the DMV, DC area had their own eviction moratorium that they had to contend with the courts. So it's very complicated to me, so I'd be very interested in knowing how you navigate that.
It is complex because every time you add an incentive or you put your finger on the scale, it produces results, some desirable, some undesirable. I'll give you an example. During the pandemic, we had a lot of people out of work because the economy slowed down, and the federal government allowed the states to add supplemental unemployment benefits. And the unattended consequence, that might have been necessary during the height of the pandemic. When I came into office, the pandemic was over. So we were the first state in the country to eliminate supplemental unemployment benefits. 26 other states followed us. And what that did was it shifted the emphasis back to going to work so that people could have the satisfaction of holding a job. And we also, the prior administration had shut down many small businesses across the state, implemented mask mandates. I think Montanans can make those decisions for themselves. There's nothing wrong with wearing a mask, but it should be the individual's decision, not government doing a mandate. So we removed all that. And that was really a key piece of getting our economy going again.
thank you. We got another question here from our virtual audience. Then we'll get you, Linda.
Yeah.
What is the biggest takeaway from the Montana miracle? You see it's catching on. That other states should implement to help with their own housing supply challenges?
Well, I would say the task force is really the unique thing that we did. I can stand up and tell you my opinion, and not everybody believes me. But when you bring a broad section of bipartisan folks together around a table with a very clear charge to produce results, it happens. And I would, if you search on the internet for Montana Governor Housing Task Force, the minutes from all the meetings are there, the agendas, the makeup of the committee, it's all there. And it's a model anybody can copy. I steal good ideas wherever I find them.
Linda?
Yes, sir. I'm with BPC, and I run the early childhood program here, and we've done some work in Montana mapping your need for childcare. I'm curious as to what your plans are for that, because related to housing and economic development, everything, people can't go to work if they don't
Yep.
have it. Just your thoughts on that and where the state's going.
Yeah, so we've made some significant investments there, and you're right. I mean, the child care workforce is the workforce behind the workforce. And if we don't have them, people can't join the other businesses. So we made it a priority. I think we put over $100 million into grants to child care providers. That was the first thing. The second thing we did was we had a labyrinth of licensing requirements that made it difficult for child care to operate. So we've modified those to make it easier. We expanded licensure to allow more in-home care, which makes a lot of sense in a lot of our rural communities where you're not going to have a big center someplace, but a mom or dad who decides to stay home with their kids might take 3 or 4 other kids into their home. That can be a real help for other working families in that community. So, but we had to change the licensure rules to allow that to happen more broadly.
We'll hit you in a second. One question here from our virtual audience. Have you run into any opposition to some of your pro-housing ideas from Republicans? I know Montana's the legislature is run by Republicans, both houses, or local communities. And if so, how did you go about trying to persuade them and get them on board?
Yeah, so yes. Human beings don't like change. Any change,
Yeah.
right or left. That's just the nature of human beings. So I would say the key thing in what we did was really to always focus on what we wanted the outcome to be. No one would disagree that we want our teachers, our nurses, and our police officers to live in the communities where they serve. And we always tried to bring the conversation back to that. And I find the same thing's true when we talk about education policy. You know, our goal in education policy ought to be to help every child reach their full potential, regardless of their background or circumstances or abilities. And when you use a noble lens to look at a really complicated issue, it can really simplify the decision making.
Was there concern about sprawl in Montana? If you didn't have that density, improve housing density in the communities that already exist, and you had to build out further and further away, you'd have a sort of a sense of sprawl. Was that a concern?
This was really interesting because this challenge brought together people on the same side of the table that had never worked together before.
Interesting.
Because as we looked at zoning changes that got rid of exclusionary zoning, the builders loved that because it meant they could do denser, they could turn inventory faster. The conservation groups loved it too. When did we ever have the builders and the conservation people on the same side of the table? But we had the same goal, which was to allow our teachers and nurses and police officers to live in the communities where they worked.
Great. Thank you for that. Yes, sir. Could you please stand?
Yeah. Thank you, Governor. I'm curious, what do you have to say to Montanans, you know, in industries like construction and building, considering rising cost of living? What do you have to say to them who work very hard to provide for their families, you know, regardless of whether you blame the administration or not for those costs of living? What do you have to say to them?
The people that work in the building trades. Well, they're making a good income. I was with an electrician in Billings, Montana last month, and they're hiring high school graduates. They come to work at $20 or $25 an hour day one, while they go to school at night remotely. Every time they pass a set of courses, they get a raise. And when they get their full journeyman certificate after 4 years of school, they have no debt. And in Billings, Montana, they start at $80,000 a year. That's starting salary for an electrician in Billings, Montana. So there's a lot of people that spend 4 or 6 years getting a bachelor's degree don't start at $80,000 a year. So these are great careers. It's noble work. The work of building shelter for human beings is inherently good and worthwhile. So we're just telling that story to high school students so they can consider it as they think about a career choice.
Great. We have another question. This is a really good one from our virtual audience. Montana has a high percentage of elderly households compared to other states. How is your administration working to ensure that there's sufficient accessible housing for elderly Montanans?
Yeah, and a lot of these elderly Montanans have been in their home a long time.
Yeah, and don't want to leave.
And don't want to leave. That's why, but you know, as property taxes continue to tick up, it's difficult for people on a fixed income. This is why allowing them to add an ADU, allowing them maybe to put an apartment over the garage, adds second income that in many cases allows them to stay. Or maybe their kids live across town and they put an apartment in for grandma. You know, so it works both ways. Higher density, more affordability helps the nurses and the teachers, but it also helps the elderly as well. I mean, housing affordability helps everyone.
Are you looking at property tax relief for elderly Montanans, or is that something I heard you mention?
And a couple of things. We dramatically expanded our property tax relief for lower income Montanans. Often that is elderly. We also just kicked off a property tax relief task force. In this last session, we gave almost $4,000 back to every Montana family in tax rebates. That was a one-time event out of our surplus, but we need to do more to get property taxes down.
Mm-hmm. Great. Yes. Could you please stand?
Oh, sure, sorry.
Thank you.
I kind of want to hear more about the AI and regulation stuff. I never thought about using AI that way, so I'd love to learn about what else you're doing that way.
Sure. So I think AI has a lot of promise. We don't know exactly how we're going to use it yet. I mentioned one, rewriting the regs at a lower education level. We still have to edit them, make sure they're still accurate and everything. The other way we're doing it, we're doing an experiment, and I'll just frame it. It's not in production, but it's an experiment. We have a lot of social welfare programs, food stamps, TANF, rental assistance, job training, you can go on. And there's literally dozens of these programs. And it's very difficult for people to navigate that. So we have a number of job service offices around the state, and they primarily, about 200 people, they tend to cater to people that have a lot of difficulty finding employment. It might be a single mom who can't find childcare or this. And the counselors in those offices tend to use a particular program, whatever their program is, and they recommend it. So we're doing an AI experiment around that will rationalize these dozens of programs. We're calling it the Prosperity Portal, which will look at all the various social welfare and job training programs and build a path to prosperity for that individual based on their particular situation, instead of some counselor in some job service office who has a hammer and the world looks like a nail, you know. So I don't know where that's going to go, but I hope I can report back on progress there.
Thank you. I think I'm going to close with a final question. Governor, you didn't have to engage in public service. I mean, you've served, you put yourself in the arena twice. When you ran for Congress, you've run for governor. You didn't have to do this. So what drives you, and what words of wisdom would you impart to other younger people who might want to pursue a career in public service or politics?
Well, my wife and I have been incredibly blessed. We've lived the American dream. The last business we started in our home with $5,000, and it grew to 1,100 employees with 17 offices around the world, publicly traded for 8 years, and it was great. And then I recognized how policies were impeding myself and others from attaining similar results. So for me, I think our founding fathers always envisioned that people in public service would have put a career in as a lawyer or a farmer or a business person and then gone into public service later. So for me, I really believe that to whom much is given, much is expected. So this is really an act of service for us. We saw our 4 kids don't live in Montana anymore.
Why not?
Well, that's a good question. But if I'm out with a group like this and I ask Montanans, how many of you have kids or grandkids that don't live here anymore? Almost every hand goes up. And it was really because Montana wasn't living up to its full potential. So being able to take that business experience, bring it to public service, and create better outcomes for Montanans, it's truly the honor of my life. I love the work, and that's really what motivates me.
Well, thank you for your public service, and thank you for what you're doing in housing, and thank you for joining us today, even with a little blip in the proceedings. But I want to encourage everyone to give a round of applause to Governor Gianforte and to the First Lady. So thank you. That's all the time we have. Please stay tuned. Mark your calendar for February 28th from 2 to 3 p.m. We'll be having a webinar on homelessness moderated by Henry Cisneros, Mayor Karen Bass of Los Angeles, Mayor Daniel Rickman of Columbia, South Carolina, and former Mayor Anise Parker of Houston. Should be a great conversation. But again, thank you for joining us, and have a great day, everyone.